Hey Twisters, welcome to my 2023 NHL Offseason Power Rankings. So what I'm going to do is rank all 32 teams based on how strong I think they are headed into this upcoming season. It's not so much about me grading their offseason. I'm happy to do that for a separate video. But as you'll see here, some of the teams that are at the bottom of these rankings actually had very good off seasons. Of course, let me know your thoughts about these rankings in the comments down below. Who's too high, who's too low, and stick around for more coverage of the offseason. I'm going to put out videos on breakout players by position. I'll put out videos predicting the leading point scorer and leading goal scorer for each team, all sorts of ideas like that. Let me know if you have any ideas in the comments down below. And without further ado, let's get into it. So in 32nd, I have the Philadelphia Flyers, and this is where they should be, right? Because Briere comes in, the rebuild is in full effect here. They trade away Kevin Hayes, they trade away Ivan Provorov, and of course, they get a great haul in return for him. James Van Riemsdyk walks in free agency, and they add a few players just to kind of round out the roster so that way they're at the cap floor at the very least. And I would expect them to stay kind of down here throughout the season if they were to trade either Carter Hart or Travis Konechny. Also, you got to shout out that they drafted Matvei Michkov, so that gives the Flyers fans something to be excited for in the future. Now we get to 31st, and I have the Montreal Canadiens. Now, I didn't include every single player added or subtracted from the roster with these rankings. I did my best with this. There's a lot to keep track of. But for the Canadiens, again, they should be in this position. They took a bit of a step forward this past year. They have lots of young talent. Hopefully, they have an opportunity to do that again this year. What's kind of holding them back is that it's going to be a very challenging division. There are other teams that were at the bottom of that division who could possibly rise this year. For the Canadiens, it's another year for the youth to develop. Hopefully Alex Newhook could be part of that. He was acquired here in the offseason in a trade with the Avalanche. They've got Cole Caulfield locked up long term. Curious to know what a full season of Slavkovsky looks like. But yeah, they're not expected to be a playoff team this season. Now we get to 30th. I've got my San Jose Sharks, and I would put them at the very bottom if they had traded Erik Karlsson. We'll see what happens with that situation. And with the Sharks, yeah, they're in a rebuild. It's going to be a number of years, just like the Flyers. But I like what Grier has done in the offseason. And you take a look at the additions and subtractions here. They do lose Noah Gregor and Yevgeny Svechnikov, who did provide some depth offense for them. But they actually made a great trade for Anthony Duclair for just a year at $3 million. And hopefully he'll help put some butts in the seats here because the Sharks are really starved for attendance. But yeah, I like that. I like the Blackwood trade as well. But again, we're going to be competing for a lottery spot or a chance to win the draft lottery in 2024. In 29th, I have the Blackhawks. Now, one thing I want to point out here is where it says last year 30th out of 32. That's where they finished in the standings at the end of the season. So the Blackhawks were the third worst team in the NHL. Now with the Hawks, we expect that Connor Bedard will be on the roster. I would think that he would be a contributor in helping the team kind of take a bit of a step forward. Hopefully some other young talent can develop alongside him. But at the same time, they also do have Taylor Hall on the roster. They bring in some veterans like Perry and Foligno, even Ryan Donato. So hopefully that will help Connor Bedard a little bit. And this is a team that's really building itself from the ground up. I mean, no more Patrick Kane, no more Jonathan Taves. So it's going to be a tough couple of years for Chicago. But again, they expect to be in that sort of position. In 28th, I have the Anaheim Ducks. They finished at the bottom last year. Now with this team, I do expect them to take a step forward with a full season of Mason McTavish. Of course, you got Trevor Zegras. Really curious to see what happens on the John Gibson front, how much of a role Lukáš Dostal has as perhaps their second goaltender and maybe their goaltender of the future. I expect this team to do a little bit better. They added Radko Gudas. They have Alex Killorn. They have some other veterans on the team. One more year of Henrique. They've got, of course, Vetrano and Strome as well. So I do expect them to do a little bit better, even though they did lose a couple veterans. Max Comtois, I'm kind of surprised they weren't able to hang on to him. But anyway, the Ducks, I think, will get their way out of the cellar in the Pacific at the least. 27th, I have the Arizona Coyotes. They finished 27th this past season in what was a very surprisingly better campaign that we would have expected with Tournier at the helm there as head coach. Now, they loaded up a fair bit here in the offseason. They got themselves Sean Durzi from the Kings for just a second-round pick. I like that deal. Jason Zucker from the Penguins, good bounce-back year from him. Kerfoot and Bukestad, that adds some depth there to the middle six or the third line. And I think that's better than what they actually lost here in the offseason. So I think they have a good step forward or an opportunity to take a step forward next year, especially if they can get Dylan Guenther for the full season. They have tons of draft picks if things go awry. Of course, we're curious about the arena situation, but when it comes to the on-ice product, this team is quietly starting to make itself more competitive, and I'm glad to see them actually spending some money here in the free agency period. In 26th, I have the Columbus Blue Jackets. They finished 31st last season, but they actually had a pretty good offseason, acquiring 2 defensemen in Ivan Provorov and Damon Severson. It's going to be a little tricky to kind of break through and perhaps challenge for a wild card. Maybe if they get some better goaltending this upcoming season, they could challenge, or at least for a part of the season. They'll get Alex Texier back, and so he joins a group of a lot of young forwards who do have a lot of high upside. I recently saw on Hockey Prospecting that the Blue Jackets now have the top prospect pool in the NHL. Lots of young talent to look forward to on the roster right now and on the roster within the next couple of years. And of course, they have new head coach Mike Babcock. I'm curious to see what it's like for him after a few years out of the NHL, but he does have a lot of success on his record. All right, 25th, I've got the St. Louis Blues. Again, this was a team that I was really curious about heading into this offseason. They get Kevin Hayes on a very affordable deal in terms of how much salary they're eating. They get back Mackenzie McEachern. Now, they've lost a lot of players over the last few months, like O'Reilly and Tarasenko. Not as much in this offseason, but yeah, this team does look a little different than where it was when it was very successful just 2 years ago. I am still concerned about the defensive situation. They need to do a better job of keeping the puck out of the net. They need some help there for Binnington. They need a new backup goaltender. I would think it's going to be Joel Hofer after an excellent season in the AHL. And yeah, would Torrey Krug still be somebody who would be open to a trade if it went to a contender? That's not exactly likely to happen in this offseason, but I am curious to kind of follow that story along. All right, 24th, I've got the Calgary Flames. Now, the Flames were actually in the top half last season, finishing 16th. And I might be a little bit unfair to the Flames here because they've lost Tyler Toffoli out of their main contributors, and he was their best player last year. They still have a lot of great talent on the team, like Huberdeau and even Kadri can still contribute fairly well. And of course, Elias Lindholm. But of course, with Lindholm, with Michael Backlund, and of course with Noah Hannafin, those are players that are reportedly not interested in signing long-term with the Flames, or at least they haven't gotten that deal done yet. They're free agents in 2024, so there's been some talk about that. They have a new general manager in Craig Conroy. Ryan Huska, first year as head coach behind the bench there. So there could be a lot of turnover looming, and even though this team was excellent just 2 years ago, just from a momentum standpoint, it doesn't look like they're going to be a serious contender in that division. But hey, let me know, Flames fans especially, your thoughts in the comments down below. What direction is this team heading in? In 23rd, I have the Washington Capitals. Now, they missed the playoffs just like a couple other teams we'll talk about shortly. With this team, they add Max Pacioretty. That was a great pickup, very affordable for them. But this is a team that is getting progressively older with its key contributors. Guys like Ovechkin, Backstrom, Oshie, Carlson, all well into their 30s. So really, with the offseason they've had, can we expect them to bounce back and be better? I like the goaltending. I think the defense is at least decent for this club, but even so, they need more speed on this team. I don't know if somebody like Connor McMichael could add to that, but yeah, I don't think that they've had quite the turnaround that we would want if we were to expect them to get into the playoffs this next season. All right, now we get to 22nd. I have the Detroit Red Wings. They were 24th in the standings, and man, what a big offseason. I almost couldn't fit all these players on this sheet here. I love the Compher pickup. A big contract for him, I will say, but he's coming off an excellent season. Gostisbehere was really good with the Hurricanes on a third pairing. James Reimer, we'll see whether it's him or Lyon backing up Ville Husso. Reimer coming off a bad year. Lyon really caught fire there at the end of the season. Daniel Sprong, a sneaky good pickup after a big year with the Kraken, but they did lose a lot of players as well. But if you compare the two columns, I think they gained more than what they lost. Now, Steve Yzerman still says the team is rebuilding, but then when you add these players, when you look at the roster now, this is a team that looks like it wants to compete for a playoff spot this year. Red Wings fans, let me know your thoughts in the comments below, of course. And now we move on to 21st, and we've got the Nashville Predators. Very interesting few months for them. They were 18th in the standings last year, and don't forget, they nearly made the playoffs without Duchene, Johansson, and Philip Forsberg in the lineup there at the end. So this team could still be competitive. I know that, of course, they've made some big moves. They traded away Ryan Johansson. They bought out Matt Duchene, but at the same time, they signed Ryan O'Reilly to a fairly lengthy deal for a player of his age. Love the leadership that he brings to the club. Of course, his all-zone play. Gustav Nyquist there for a little bit more depth scoring. You've got a new general manager in Barry Trotz. You also have a new head coach in Andrew Brunette. This is somebody who had an impact with the New Jersey Devils and before that with the Florida Panthers as that interim head coach. So I'm wondering, can this team actually stay competitive in this division? I actually think there's a strong case that they could, just given that the division might be getting a little bit weaker for now. But lastly, I wonder to myself, could Jussi Saros still be on the trading block? There were talks about him possibly being moved at the trade deadline last year. All right, next up, we've got in 20th, the Vancouver Canucks. They were ranked 22nd when it came to the standings last year. You know, the Canucks, I think they've had a good offseason, not overwhelmingly amazing by any means, but by buying out Ekman-Larsson, bringing in a little bit more defensive reinforcement with Soucy and Ian Cole, that's been good for them. And I'm interested to see how this team plays with a full season of Rick Tocchet as head coach. They were 20-12-4 with him last season. Now with Boudreau, he was the interim head coach just a couple years ago. The team was awesome, and then they totally just got off to a horrible start this past season. So hopefully they don't repeat the same under Tocchet. And to better their cap situation going forward, I am intrigued to see if they will trade somebody, especially in their forward group, a winger like Brock Besser. Connor Garland has been talked about before too, but I think Besser would probably be the most movable, even though his cap hit is a little bit steep. So the Canucks might have to eat a little bit of salary. In 19th, I've got the Winnipeg Jets. They finished 14th in the standings last year. They do drop a little bit, but you know what? Even though they lost Blake Wheeler, longtime captain, despite being in the twilight of his career, and of course they lose Pierre-Luc Dubois to the Kings. I mean, look what they got back. It wasn't that bad. They get back Alex Iafallo, Gabe Vilardi, Rasmus Kupari. Bressois rejoins the team after some good play in Vegas, although, he does have a bit of injury history. This is a team that, we've been saying, why don't they just completely blow up the core? We've talked about, Hellebuck possibly being a trade target. Same thing with Mark Scheifele. They're both in the last years of their contract. Do they build around Kyle Connor and Nick Ehlers and Josh Morrissey? Or are they just kind of treading water, trying to be competitive until some of those younger players come into their system and help the team thrive? All right, 18th, we got the New York Islanders. They were 15th in the standings this past season. And look at this, right? This is a team that's very content with the roster that they have, or at least Lou Lamoriello is. Pierre Engvall signing for 7 years, Scott Mayfield for 5 years. So with the Islanders, to any Isles fans out there, I'm sorry if I'm getting a chuckle out of this, but really, they're almost just like satisfied with being a middling team. A team that's good enough to get into the playoffs, perhaps. Great goaltending, best tandem in the NHL, I would definitely have to say. They're still lacking that firepower, that top-end firepower, and so I can't really put them any higher. Are they still good enough to challenge for a playoff spot? Yeah, to finish maybe anywhere like 4th or 5th in the division, I would think so. All right, 17th. Ottawa Senators, they finished 21st this past season. And yes, we do have to consider the possibility of Alex DeBrincat being traded out. However, those talks have kind of died down from what I've been hearing in the past couple of weeks here. So that does interest me. But even if they lose DeBrincat, they still have plenty of firepower in the top 6, especially with a healthy Josh Norris. He missed pretty much all of last year. You can't forget that. They add in Jonas Korpisalo. I'm not the biggest believer in him. In terms of like inconsistent goaltenders, which a lot of them are, Korpisalo is among the most inconsistent. He can have great runs like he did with the LA Kings, especially when he was initially traded over there. But then again, you got to consider how he fared with the Blue Jackets, even though their defense hasn't always been the sharpest. So anyway, with the Sens, I still expect them to challenge for a playoff spot this upcoming season, but there still might be 1 or 2 big moves ahead for them in the offseason. 16th, I've got the Pittsburgh Penguins. Now, they missed the playoffs last year. They finished 19th in the standings, and they were a team that was trying to compete there and make the postseason. They weren't just selling off a ton of assets. I have them in 16th. I might have actually ranked them a bit too high. Big offseason for them in terms of just roster turnover. They get Riley Smith from the Knights, Lars Eller for some center depth. This is a team that really does need a more productive third-line center. I like Achari and Nieto to help with penalty killing and just defensively. Ryan Graves got a big deal as well, kind of replaces Brian Dumoulin from that standpoint. But they did lose some players, like Jason Zucker was a good contributor for them last year. Now, Kyle Dubas came in as the president of hockey operations, and obviously he's been very active so far. They still need to hire themselves a general manager, but yes, they do still have most of their core remaining with the likes of the big 3, Crosby, Letang, and Evgeny Malkin. Jake Gensel, you could put him in there as well. So, and they retain Jari. So will this team is that roster good enough to make the playoffs in that division? I don't see them cracking into the top 3, but I still think they're good enough to be challenging for a playoff spot, even though they kind of fell off a bit last year. All right, 15th, we got the Buffalo Sabres. Now, last year, they were 20th in the standings for a while there. They did challenge for a playoff spot. I do expect them to take that step forward this next year. They didn't add a whole lot to their roster, but I think that was pretty smart for the most part. They've done a good job of managing the cap space. They bring in some depth on defense with Connor Clifton and Eric Johnson, and they didn't really lose all that much in the offseason as well. So, of course, the Sabres are gunning for their first playoff berth in 12 years, or it'll be 13 looking at next year. I'm a little uncertain about the goaltending in terms of which goaltender could start, 45, 50 games for them. You do have Devin Levi, you have Eric Comrie, and you have Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen. Sabres fans, let me know what you would do with the goaltending situation going forward. But yeah, lots of young talent, lots of firepower. I'm excited to hopefully see them get into the playoffs this upcoming season. All right, 14th, I've got the Wild. They finished 11th in the standings last year. They took a bit of a step back versus 21-22 when they were scoring a ton of goals. Last year, they were a much more defensive team. And now looking at them, they are a team that looks like it needs to take a step backwards in order to take a big step forward eventually. And one reason why is because they have $14.7 million tied up in the buyouts for Zach Parise and Ryan Suter. And I think it's the same the next year, or it's very close. That's a lot of money here in the NHL. So they couldn't really do all that much with their roster in the offseason. They lose Ryan Reeves, John Klingberg, Sam Steele, Gustav Nyquist, Matt Dumba. But of course, they still have some of their best players on the roster. Kaprizov, Matt Boldy has become a star. Could he be a 35-goal scorer this next year? Maybe so. You still have Jared Spurgeon, the captain. Philip Gustafsson had a fantastic year after proving me wrong quite a bit. So is that going to be good enough to get into the playoffs in the Central Division? Again, I think the Central might be getting a little bit weaker, so there's still opportunity there. But of course, with the Wild, we still look back at the fact that they don't really have that true number one center out there. In 13th, I have the Seattle Kraken. They finished 12th in the standings last year. I don't think they really got worse or better in the offseason. I think it's pretty much the same. This is a team that already does have a lot of veterans who are coming off of fantastic seasons. This was a team that could attack with four lines. So I'm wondering, is that going to continue next year? Or is this team going to see Matty Beniers take a big step forward next year with Jared McCann and really start to carry things with that top line? Also, can the goaltending bounce back? It just has not been particularly good for them. Yeah, they do win games, but that's by outscoring some of their problems in net there. But are they still a playoff caliber team? Yeah, I don't think their roster has turned over enough to where I would think otherwise. Cap situation has been managed pretty well too. All right, 12th, I've got the Tampa Bay Lightning. Now, last year, they were, I think, 13th in the standings, so I think I just made a little typo there. Anyway, with the Bolts, I'm very curious to see what a full offseason looks like, a chance for them to really be rested going into this upcoming year, given their deep playoff runs the previous 3 years. So they did lose a lot in the offseason here. They lost their entire fourth line, Maroon, Perry, and Belmar. They lost Alex Killorn, who had a really good season for them, a 27-goal scorer, I believe, a little bit of depth on defense in Ian Cole. They do bring in some players here, but I really do think they lost more than they gained here. Of course, they still have some of the best players in the game, guys like Kucherov, Point, Hedman, Vasilevsky, Stamkos, right? So that's fantastic for them. But now we start to look at how the salary cap situation has affected their ability to produce depth on this team. 11th, I've got the LA Kings. They were 10th in the standings last year. And this is a team, it's very interesting with the Kings in the sense that, look at that right column. They lost a ton in the offseason. That Pierre-Luc Dubois trade meant that they had to cough up Iafallo, Velarde, and Kupari. They traded away Sean Durzi, and they lost some other players from a depth standpoint as well. And you look at their goaltending, right? It's Phoenix Copley and Cam Talbot. That to me doesn't look like a goaltending tandem for a team that wants to challenge for the division. But on the flip side, you look at that center depth, right? With Kopitar, Deneau, and Dubois. You look at Quentin Byfield. I think he's due for a monster season next year. They have a couple other veterans who can put the puck in the net, just like Arvidsson and Adrian Kempe. So this is a team that still has a lot of firepower. Could they maybe even be a top 5 offense in the NHL this upcoming season? The Kings, to me, I still think that they're probably one of those top 3 teams in the division, but that doesn't mean they don't have a big hole on their roster that could come back to bite them in the butt. In 10th, I have the New York Rangers, and they finished 9th in the standings this past season. Now, with the Rangers, they lost a couple of those big pieces from the trade deadline last year with Patrick Kane, Vladimir Tarasenko, Nico Mikkola, Tyler Mott. So they did lose some key contributors or players who could be key contributors on this team. So I wonder what that means for those kid line players going forward. Lafreniere, Kakko, and Hedel. They got to get their way into the top 6 this upcoming season. So that to me is a bit of a factor as to why I don't have the Rangers as high. And you do have a new head coach in Peter Laviolette. wasn't quite as successful as we would hope he would be with the Washington Capitals. So with the Rangers, I think there are a couple of uncertainties despite excellent goaltending, despite a great defensive group, but really there's a fine line between the Rangers and the two other teams ahead of them in that division. We get to ninth, and I've got the Colorado Avalanche. They finished last year in 7th in the standings. They're going to be without Gabriel Landeskog again for a full season, so that definitely does take a hit. I got to give Joe Sakic props for actually turning this into a good offseason, despite you seeing all those losses there in the right column. The salary cap situation has been managed well. Ryan Johansson does provide that second-line center expertise. Bringing in Ross Colton on a bargain I thought was great. They get Jonathan Drouin to reunite with Nathan MacKinnon. That was kind of a story there. But they did lose a lot of players here and some good contributors like Evan Rodriguez, JT Compher, Eric Johnson, longtime defenseman for that club, Matt Nieto for the PK, Lars Eller acquired at the trade deadline. Yes, they have the top-end talent with Nathan MacKinnon and Rantanen and Makar, a fantastic defensive group. I mean, I think that they're easily still a playoff team, but to get back to that level that they were 2 years ago, it's going to be pretty challenging. But I think they're still probably going to finish in the top 2 in this division. The other team in this division is the Dallas Stars. They were 8th in the standings last year. Really good season. They were exactly as I expected. They got to the conference final. And in the offseason, despite losing a couple of their contributors like Max Domi, Colin Miller for depth defense, and not buying out Ryan Suter, Jim Nill was not happy with the media about all that chatter. Anyway, really like what they did by bringing in Matt Duchene to add some scoring depth there to the second line, you would think, on a very affordable deal as well. A little bit of depth in the likes of Craig Smith and Sam Steele. However, they still need to extend Ty Dellandrea. Their cap situation is a bit tight right now, but I think they'll find a way to make that happen. And don't forget, of course, their best players are at the prime of their career, except for like Pavelski, right? Because you have Hintz at 26 years old, and Robertson's not even there. Johnston was a rookie last season. And on the backside, you have Miro Heiskanen and you have Jake Ottinger. Not a good playoffs for him, but I think he's going to be fine going forward. And Heiskanen was outstanding in all 3 zones last year, broke out offensively. So I think this team is pretty loaded. I think that they have a chance to be better this upcoming year. Defensively, they still need some work over there. Now we get to 7th, and I have the Toronto Maple Leafs. They were 4th in the standings last year, so they do drop a little bit here. They had quite a bit of roster turnover, and they have a new general manager facilitating some of that in Brad Treliving. But let's take a look here. They lost Ryan O'Reilly, who they acquired at the trade deadline, Justin Hull, Luke Shen, some depth defense there. They lost Michael Bunting, who was in their top 6 as an agitator, Achari, a good defensive forward, Kerfoot, longtime Leaf, or at least a few years there, some clutch scoring for him in the playoffs. But at the same time, they also got Tyler Bertuzzi at a very affordable deal for a year. They get Max Domi, affordable, so they do have some support there in the middle 6. They brought in John Klingberg to have a right shot from the blue line. I still think this is very much a competitive team that could easily finish in the top 3 in this division. It's going to be very difficult for them going forward, just given their contract situations with Matthews and Nylander, unrestricted free agents. There's going to be a lot of chatter around that unless they get extended here in the offseason. Not the biggest Sheldon Keefe believer personally, and they're actually over the cap a little bit. I wonder, is it Samsonov and Woll going forward? I would think so. Leafs fans, let me know your thoughts. Does this team look better than it did last season? Is it stuck in neutral, or is it actually taking a step backwards? All right, 6th, I have the Oilers, another team that I don't really think got better in the offseason, but they didn't really get all that worse. They did lose some depth in the likes of Bugstad. I liked how he played in the postseason. Costin came on strongly after that trade. Yamamoto got bought out, and a couple depth players, of course. They get Connor Brown, who does add some offensive depth to this team, but it's still McDavid and Draisaitl's team. Given the Pacific Division, they're still a top 3 team in my opinion, but I would hope that Jack Campbell can be a factor in helping them compete for the division. Really bad season for him. Although Skinner played well for them in the regular season, I think they still have work to do with tightening up the defense. Speaking of the defense, they only have about $5.6 million in cap space to sign Evan Bouchard, who was fantastic for them in the second half and in the playoffs. You also have to consider Ryan McLeod, not Michael McLeod. He's on the Devils. So yeah, there's still a couple of question marks with this team, but overall, this is still a very strong club compared to the rest of the other teams in their division, although there's one more I still have to talk about. 5th, I have the Panthers. Now, the Panthers, of course, made the final, but at the same time, they finished 17th in the standings last year. So I was like, all right, where am I going to rank these guys, right? So I think 5th is a respectable ranking for the Cats. They came on very strongly in the second half last year, although Alex Lyon was a big piece as to why they snuck into the playoffs, right? And don't forget, the Blackhawks and Blue Jackets beat the Penguins for this to happen. So big offseason for Bill Zito. I like the Rodriguez signing. They bring in Anthony Stolarz for some goaltending insurance. They bring in OEL, Kulikov, and also they brought in Mike Riley to help out with defense. They did lose a couple of defensemen as well. Anthony Duclair was sent packing, only a $3 million cap hit. I did find that surprising, although I'm a Sharks fan, so I liked it. They lost Gudis for that intimidation, but when you look at this team, they're still very strong with the likes of Matthew Tkachuk, with Sasha Barkov, with Brandon Montour, with somebody like Verhaeghe, Anton Lundell, right? So they still have plenty of talent, absolutely. With all this roster turnover, can they still play in Maurice's system that they really bought into at the end of this last year? So that's kind of a big storyline for them. And also, I wonder, what's the future for Spencer Knight? You brought in Anthony Stolarz from the Ducks. You have Bobrovsky, of course, with that steep cap hit for the next few seasons. He had to step aside toward the end of this last season. He was supposed to be the goaltender of the future for this team. And if he is on top of his game, does that actually get this team into a top 3 spot in the division? All right, fourth, I've got the Bruins. Now, I know that they had an incredible regular season, but at the same time, of course, they lost in the first round of the playoffs to the Panthers. I still think fourth is a respectable ranking for them, considering, look at all the players that they've lost. And of course, in yellow there, I have Bergeron and Krejci, because we don't know what's going to happen. I would be surprised if Bergeron walked away. I would, actually. He's such a huge contributor for them still. And I think that, last year he took a very affordable team deal to stick around. But then again, they lost Bertuzzi, they lost Dmitry Orlov, Taylor Hall, Garnet Hathaway. Those are some fairly key contributors on that club. They bring in Van Riemsdyk on a great deal. A little bit of defensive depth there with Shattenkirk, Morgan Geekie, a young center, maybe could fit into the fourth line for them. So right now, as it stands, it is pretty thin at center. However, they did a fairly good job with the cap space despite all their losses. They have the cap to sign Swayman. The goaltending tandems can still be great, and they might actually have a little bit of change for Patrice Bergeron. Third, I have the New Jersey Devils. They finished third in the standings this past season. And yeah, I mean, what a season they had last year, and who knows, the pieces might be in play for them to build on top of that this year. You had Timo Meier extended to a long-term deal, Jesper Bratt as well, lots of firepower. Jack Hughes coming off a stellar season. I'm really excited to see what this next year looks like for him as he matures and continues to get better. And you also have Luke Hughes, his brother. We could see a full season of him on the blue line for them. Yeah, they did lose a couple of defensemen like Damon Severson and Ryan Graves, but I still think that group looks pretty solid, and they have lots of great young talent in their prospect pool. Goaltending, I think it's a good tandem. Vanacek and Schmid. Love the Toffoli acquisition. That's great, especially considering they lost somebody like Tatar and his productive year. All right, now in second, and this is basically a tie with the Devils, I have the Hurricanes, although the Canes beat them in the playoffs and edged them out just a bit in the division. They were second in the NHL this last year. Interesting offseason, they bring in Dmitry Orlov, $7.75 million for the next 2 years. That's a steep cap hit for already what is maybe the best defense in the Eastern Conference. They add Michael Bunting, who could play in that top 6. I still think they need that real finisher in the top 6. I am excited to have Andrei Svechnikov back on the team. I'm a Canes fan for the Eastern Conference, by the way. I still think it's a great team. They did lose a lot, but they still have their main contributors like Aho, free agent next year. Jarvis was great for them this last year. He's going to be even better. Now, they might be able to still improve if they're able to deal away somebody like Brett Pesce. They've been talked about as one of the parties interested in Erik Karlsson, which to me would still be kind of bizarre, but it's always a fun topic to explore there. They do have a little bit of depth that they've lost, but even so, I think the Canes are still a very stacked team on defense. They're strong in net. They're not elite, I would say, but with the way their defense really contains attacking teams, I think the Carolina Hurricanes can still thrive winning a lot of games 3-2. And in first, we've got the Vegas Golden Knights. How could I not put them at the very top, especially given that they did a good job with managing their cap so far in the offseason, kind of trimming the fat in terms of being able to move on from players they don't need as much, like Riley Smith, even though a longtime Golden Knight, probably a fan favorite out there. Their best contributors are still on the roster. Marchessault, Eichel, Stone. A lot of those defensemen are still around as well. So I have to give Kelly McCrimmon a lot of credit there. A little bit intrigued about the goaltending situation. They need Leonard to stay on IR this next year if they want to still be cap compliant. They did extend Aiden Hill. I'm curious to see what a full season looks like with him. I would think he's going to have more of a responsibility, although Logan Thompson was great for them this past season before his injury. So anyway, the Golden Knights to me, I think, are still a team that should finish in the top 3 in that division at the very least. And yeah, they don't really give me too much of a reason as to why they can't be, a team challenging for another Stanley Cup this next year. Anyway, guys, what are your thoughts on my power rankings? Who's too high? Who's too low? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Shout out any ideas you have for off-season content, and stick around. We've got more videos planned for you here on Twisted Wrister Hockey. I'm Nick. I'll catch you Twisters later. Ciao.